it comes to UNRWA, a broader element. I mean, UNRWA is an agency with a very specific mandate. It's an old agency. It was established in 1948, actually 2 years before UNHCR, to provide services and relief to a very particular refugee demographic. And in that sense, the Palestinian refugee issue is at the core of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In that sense, where we do humanitarian/development work, the context in which we operate is very political. And it would appear that in some parts of the spectrum that is more critical of UNRWA's work, humanitarian and development work that we provide is being conflated with taking a certain political position, which we're not doing, right? So we clearly say we provide services as mandated as long as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict continues, and hopefully a sustainable and fair political solution will be found quickly. At the moment, it doesn't look like that, but in that context, we are of course bound by the mandate. And I'm saying this because clearly as an agency that operates in such a political context, there are then detractors, political actors with certain interests that may perhaps believe that if you get rid of UNRWA as an agency, the Palestinian refugee question disappears.
Welcome everyone, and today in this very episode of Middle East Insights platform, we are talking live from Jerusalem, and we are talking with Roland Friedrich, and he has just become the director of UNRWA Affairs in West Bank. Before that, he was a senior security sector advisor at Office of Quartet in the International Development Law Organization at Rome. He worked with United Nations as the Chief Joint Analysis and Reporting Hub, United Nations Support Mission in Libya. And before that, the head of office in Palestinian territories in Ramallah. So before I start, sir, on behalf of our community over here in India, we would like to pay our condolences to the lives of 220 UNRWA officials that have been lost. The most recent one on September 13th, when a sanitation worker was killed by a sniper attack in West Bank on his terrace by Israel. And it means a lot that during these very difficult situations, where it's going to be almost 1 year of the genocide, you have taken out time so early in the morning to talk with us. So, sir, my first question is, how do you predict that the escalation of Israeli attacks on Lebanon specifically now would have an impact on West Bank, Golan Heights, and Gaza in the coming months?
Well, thank you very much indeed for having me. To start with, great pleasure to be able to speak to all of you. I think what we've seen over the past couple of days is a new layer, a new level of escalation in the region after almost 11 months now of conflict originating from the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October last year. The impact of that conflict on UNRWA and its operations has been significant. To give you a bit of background, UNRWA operates in 5 fields of operation in the Near East. That is Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. And clearly our operations in the Gaza Strip have been heavily affected by Israeli military operation there. Since the beginning of the war, you mentioned it, we lost 220 staff members, more than 40,000 Palestinians killed, according to generally cited figures. Mass displacement in the Gaza Strip, 1.9 million people on the move in the Gaza Strip, some of them displaced multiple times, and a very severe humanitarian crisis. So that is already something that the agency has been responding to the extent that's possible in that protracted crisis. In the West Bank, we've also seen a significant deterioration of the situation. I'll be happy to talk about that a bit more in detail later on. And now also Lebanon. In Lebanon, we do have a significant community of refugees. Since yesterday, in particular, the onset of the very heavy Israeli airstrikes, since yesterday morning, we've seen increased displacement of Lebanese from southern Lebanon. And some of our refugee camps are also in the south of the country. So clearly there are concerns that the situation there from a humanitarian perspective will continue to get worse. And it's clearly something where the agency will be asked to respond. We've put in place some emergency plans, particularly for our beneficiaries there. Perhaps one thing to say from the onset, not all Palestine refugees, registered Palestine refugees, do live in refugee camps. Certainly not in the West Bank. In Lebanon, it's a bit more prescribed. But whatever happens in terms of hostilities has a direct impact on our beneficiaries on the ground, and we're very concerned about the situation in Lebanon.
So recently now Israel has stopped giving visas to UNRWA officials and many other humanitarian organizations. So how do you navigate through these crises when your entry, exit, especially, that is under massive surveillance? There is so much of delay. For example, recently when the UNRWA vehicles were trying to get into Gaza with the polio vaccinations, they were stopped for almost 8 to 9 hours. So how do you navigate these stressful conditions? Because it's also a matter of great scare for the UNRWA officials operating on ground if they're wearing the UNRWA vest, because that also makes them the target. So how do you navigate such challenges?
It is a difficult situation. I think it is important to look at the whole picture and be aware of the various details. I mean, perhaps backing up a bit, what UNRWA does is to provide services. UNRWA is a service provider. And in times of emergency, we also engage in humanitarian support. And that's exactly what we do in the West Bank to some extent, in the Gaza Strip and to some extent in the West Bank. So normally what we do is service delivery for Palestine refugees across a range of areas: education services, healthcare, social protection, microfinance support, infrastructure, camp improvement, and so on and so forth. So that's the normal business. And then you have, in times of crisis, be it the war in Gaza, be it the earthquake in Syria, the emergency response that we do together with other UN partners. So UNRWA is part of the UN family. What we have seen, unfortunately, since the beginning of the war and actually increasing of the past couple of months, is a shrinking of the humanitarian space. And that has a number of manifestations. One of them being, for instance, the lack in the Gaza Strip of reliable deconfliction for aid to move. That has led to severe incidents, in some regards, killing of members of humanitarian organizations. Gaza Strip, as you said, we lost 220 UNRWA staff members. Other UN agencies also lost staff members. DSS, the Department of Safety and Security, lost an international staff member. So that is a very deadly context for humanitarian workers to operate in. Another manifestation of that shrinking humanitarian space are indeed access restrictions for international organizations. It's not that we do not receive visas. We do have access to the State of Israel. We maintain constructive relations with the State of Israel at various levels. But clearly the duration of the visa is not as it used to be. So the duration of the visa is shrinking. There are also certain organizations who have come under particular scrutiny, including UNRWA, given the allegations of a limited number of UNRWA staff members in Gaza having participated in the attack of 7 October. So there is this, but there's also, of course, when it comes to UNRWA, a broader element. I mean, UNRWA is an agency with a very specific mandate. It's an old agency. It was established in 1948, actually 2 years before UNHCR, to provide services and relief to a very particular refugee demographic. And in that sense, the Palestinian refugee issue is at the core of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In that sense, where we do humanitarian/development work, the context in which we operate is very political. And it would appear that in some parts of spectrum that is more critical of UNRWA's work, humanitarian and development work that we provide is being conflated with taking a certain political position, which we're not doing, right? So we clearly say we provide services as mandated as long as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict continues, and hopefully a sustainable and fair political solution will be found quickly. At the moment, it doesn't look like that, but in that context, we're of course bound by the mandate. And I'm saying this because clearly as an agency that operates in such a political context, there are then detractors, political actors with certain interests that may perhaps believe that if you get rid of UNRWA as an agency, the Palestinian refugee question disappears, which in my view is a rather narrow reading, because clearly identity of Palestinian refugees is much deeper rooted in the conflict. It doesn't have to do necessarily with the existence of an agency such as UNRWA. Even if UNRWA was removed and services were perhaps sort of extended by other organizations, that self-perception that lays at the core of the conflict among Palestinian refugees would remain.
So, sir, coming to specifically now dividing the questions into three parts, what are the challenges that are faced specifically in West Bank? Is it the entry and exit? How do you enter? Like, is it through Jordan or is it through Tel Aviv? Like, first, what are the restrictions? Second, what is the entry and exit and the restrictions in Gaza? And thirdly, about East Jerusalem. Like, in these three specific entities, what are the very respective and even the minutest challenges that the officials face?
Thank you very much. Maybe to go a bit into detail here. From the UN's perspective, we talk about the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. And the ICJ has recently confirmed the international position that the West Bank and East Jerusalem are occupied territory. Yeah. Administratively, from an Israeli perspective, the Greater Jerusalem municipality is seen as an integral part of the State of Israel, and it was annexed to the State of Israel through legislation but from a UN perspective, it's clear we deliver the services in the West Bank to all Palestinian refugees that are registered, be it residing in occupied East Jerusalem or in fact in the occupied West Bank. And in the Gaza Strip, it's a bit different in the sense that, I'm not speaking about the legal situation, but de facto Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005, hence controlled entry and access to the Gaza Strip to a large extent, not exclusively, but to a large extent. And since the beginning of the war has resumed full control over entry and access into the Gaza Strip. So it's a slightly different situation. I think what is also important to understand that in the West Bank, you do have the presence of the Israeli military and Israeli settlers, which at the moment, in the Gaza Strip, clearly, as we said, since 2005, Israeli settlements were removed. So the contexts are slightly different. The way, as a UN agency, we operate is clearly through diplomatic relations with the government of Israel. That means sort of staff moving in and out. They have certain privileged immunities under the applicable international legal instruments, be it the UN Charter, be it the General Convention, be it also our arrangement with the government of Israel. And normally, staff move, through various border crossings in and out as in any other sort of country of operation where the UN is active. What we've seen, though, in the West Bank, specifically since the 7th of October, is a closure regime imposed on the West Bank as such. When you look on a map, you have the 1967 borders, the green line, and you have the Israeli separation/security barrier, which basically cuts in various parts deeply into the West Bank. The Palestinian workers, for instance, from the West Bank, depending on the estimate, roughly 160,000, probably more, have not been able to access their former workplaces in Israel or, in fact, within Israeli settlements. So that has been in place with very limited exceptions. That has been in place since the 7th of October, with the devastating impact on the Palestinian economy in the West Bank. We also have issues, and it's not just UNRWA, it also relates to other UN agencies, sometimes even to embassies. Staff who work for international presence in East Jerusalem but have a West Bank ID have not been able to access East Jerusalem. And that's not specific, as I said, for UNRWA, it's a broader issue as part of the post-7th of October measures imposed by Israel. And then perhaps sort of closing the loop on the West Bank, we do have also movement restrictions and access restriction within the West Bank. Yeah. Checkpoint regime that has been loosened somewhat over the past 4 months, in the sense that it's a bit easier now to move about. But there is an additional complication for UNRWA, and that is that since the allegations against the agency came up in January, we do see a lack of respect for the status of our local Palestinian colleagues that are UN staff, that wear UNRWA vests, that have UNRWA ID cards, that drive in UNRWA vehicles, where they are increasingly exposed to harassment, intimidation, sometimes aggressions at checkpoints. So that is something that is concerning. We do have, of course, an active civil-military coordination structure in the West Bank. We need to have that because of the level of service provided on the ground. Just to give you a better an overview, we run 96 schools in the West Bank, more than 40 health centers, 3 vocational training centers, social protection support to more than 100,000 beneficiaries. So people need to be able to move, or staff need to be able to go from city to village to locations. So for that, we need an effective civil-military coordination structure. These problems that we face, we raise them with the Israeli military on a regular basis. And sometimes we see improvement, sometimes not. But that's perhaps for the West Bank. When it comes to the Gaza Strip, of course, the situation is much more severe in the sense that movement in and out of the Gaza Strip is severely restricted. Within the Gaza Strip, you cannot move as a UN agency delivering aid without close coordination and hopefully also deconfliction with the Israeli military. That system has not been working effectively. But on top of that, we also see increasing breakdown of law and order in the Gaza Strip. So when you look at the situation at the moment, the Israeli military presence is focused on the so-called Philadelphia corridor, that is essentially a strip running across the border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt, and another area that bisects the Gaza Strip in the northern part called the Netzarim corridor. So that's where you have the Israeli military being present at the moment. But of course, they're continuing airstrikes, continuing raids into other parts of the Gaza Strip, which basically very much lies in ruins. So moving in these places, you need to deconflict in order not to be exposed to airstrikes or other attacks. But you also need to make sure that, for example, and that is very difficult, that the aid you deliver is being protected. We see more and more phenomena of organized crime, local criminal outfits that attack the aid convoys, but often also desperate beneficiaries, because clearly what we need in Gaza in terms of aid is not what we're receiving. There's a massive problem with the delivery of sufficient amounts of aid, and making sure that that not only reaches into the Gaza Strip, but then also reaches the people who desperately need it.
Yes, sir. As you talked about the allegations, why do you think that the allegations emerged? That UNRWA officials in Gaza are, communicating with Hamas or are working with Hamas. Was it a certain kind of just a conjecture to distract from the real question of civilian deaths and genocide happening? Or was it a political move?
I mean, perhaps starting with what happened, we received these allegations concerning, I think, 13 staff members in late January this year.
Yeah.
In Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, we have a staffing table of roughly 15,000 staff. It's a huge organization. And normally, as in every place where we operate, we share with the host country authorities for privileges and immunities purposes every year the list of our staff members. So, that we generally do in every country. It's not unique to the Gaza Strip, to hospital, or in fact the Israeli government. And we also notify usually both the de facto authorities on the ground and the Israeli authorities of so-called neutrality violations. That means when we see incidents around our installations that would put the neutrality of our organization at risk. That can take different forms. It could be sort of suspicion of a cavity in the ground where you might suspect that there's a tunnel being constructed. It might be the use of the facility by armed actors and so on and so forth. Or in fact also, of course, military activity, that an airstrike. That's not specific to now, that goes back 15 years, right? So when these allegations came up, we took them very seriously because the nature of these allegations was grave, and they posed a risk to the reputation of the agency. That's why the Commissioner General then took the decision to separate these staff members from service. Then immediately called for an investigation, and an investigation was then launched, not by UNRWA, but by the Office of Internal Oversight of the UN in New York. And that investigation has led to some conclusions. We have not been able to corroborate fully that these allegations were true, but given the gravity and the significance of the evidence that was provided, we have decided to keep the separation of these, termination of these staff members from service in place. And it's a very complex context, right? The Gaza Strip has been under the effective control of the Hamas movement through the de facto authorities there for more than 15 years.
Yeah.
That means that almost every sphere of life in the Gaza Strip was under control, or at least under the influence of Hamas. We, of course, sort of hearing these allegations, are very disappointed that staff members might have participated in that and might have betrayed the organization through these acts. Again, the legal assessment, it's not been fully conclusive, but we remain in the position that these staff members are terminated to protect the reputation of the agency. That is perhaps the background on sort of that more a more concrete manifestation of the allegation and the traction we've seen. Of course, when these allegations came out, there was a media blitz. There was very rash decision-making by a number of donors who then decided to suspend their funding literally over the weekend. And in order to address that concern, which would have had massive implications for our ability to deliver services, the organization, as I said, called and then sort of supported this independent investigation by YOS in New York, but secondly also established a working group, an independent working group, to look at our safeguards of neutrality. And that working group was led by the former French Foreign Minister, Catherine Colonna, in essence, in a very meticulous manner, reviewing with experts, independent experts, all our neutrality procedures and safeguards. And they came up with a number of recommendations. The main finding was that UNRWA as an agency has given the context it works in, more developed, more effective neutrality safeguards than almost any other UN agency operating in the region. So that's positive. Having said that, there are things where we can do better and where we're committed to doing better. And the action plan that derived from this report is now being implemented. And it was important for us because we needed to do that to rebuild the trust with the donors who had basically decided to stop funding us. Now, since then, out of these 16 donors, 15 donors have returned. That means that the financial situation of the agency is by far not perfect, but it allowed us at least to continue delivering the bulk of our services. There's one thing a lot of people do not know is that UNRWA does not operate country offices like other UN agencies. We have one big budget. That means any funding gap that we have, whether because of delayed donor payments or politically motivated decisions, has an immediate impact on our ability to deliver services, not only in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, but also in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan, which then has additional repercussions also for stability in these countries, of course. So we're very pleased that most donors decided to come back. But going back to your second part, I mean, clearly there is a political undertone in some of those allegations, and particularly the way they've been used.
Yeah.
For years we have detractors who, for political reasons, believe UNRWA is not desirable and should be abolished. And of course, these allegations then provide a lot of ammunition for in some cases, orchestrated campaigns to undermine and smear the reputation of the agency. And that is problematic from a number of angles. It poses risks to staff, puts staff at risk. It basically limits our ability to address the needs of our beneficiaries. But it's also something that, looking at some more recent developments, it goes to the heart of what the UN stands for in many ways, because clearly the UN is committed as a cornerstone of the multilateral order and rules-based international order. And in that regard, having such a sustained public and behind-the-scenes attack against the agency, it sets a very problematic precedent for the UN's ability also to operate in other places in the world if these efforts are successful.
So, sir, which countries have resumed funding as of now, as we speak?
Out of the 16 who suspended funding, all of them have resumed, except for the United States. In the United States, the Congress took a decision to suspend UNRWA funding until the coming financial year. So that funding suspension is in place until March 2025 by congressional. Of course, we're working actively with our member states, in that case, of course, US government, on seeking to overturn that decision. So it's not an automatic renewal. It's got to be a decision again to extend that funding freeze after the end of March next year. We hope that there will be enough recognition of the work we've done and enough trust being rebuilt for the United States to resume funding. The United States, as you will know, was until very recently the largest funder of the organization overall, of UNRWA. Yeah. Largest funder of UNRWA. And while funding was also suspended under the Trump administration, at that time, it came with a bit of a run-up time. When the US administration under President Trump decided to stop the funding, we had time to prepare and look for alternatives. And we didn't have, wars raging now, no, we're in a different situation. So we do hope that indeed Congress will reconsider its decision and allow the US administration, whatever it might be, after the first week of November to resume funding.
So do you think that any kind of changes in the election result in US might have an impact on the funding or on how the entire bureaucracy of US functions, be it Trump or Kamala Harris, whoever is elected?
I would not want to speculate about the results of the elections. But clearly we've seen in the past that President Trump, when he was president, did suspend the funding to the agency. No matter what outcome the elections bring, we do hope that the United States will reconsider its position and resume funding to UNRWA.
Also, sir, as more and more countries start recognizing the state of Palestine diplomatically, would it also empower the condition for UNRWA?
I think it's a very interesting question. I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I mean, clearly, as UNRWA, we don't take a position on this. I mean, we're a humanitarian development agency, and recognition is conferred bilaterally by the member states. We've seen an upgrade in the state of Palestine's position within the UN system. Now, for the first time this year during the UNGA, and after UNGA's decision, basically to upgrade Palestine's status, and it clearly allows Palestinians to have a more active voice and participate directly in a lot of procedures in the UN that they weren't able to do before. So that is clearly something that is new. From UNRWA's perspective, we are here because there is no political solution. That means as long as there is no Palestinian entity, be it State of Palestine, be it some other kind of administration, whatever is acceptable to Palestinians and whatever the parties, Israel and Palestine, can agree upon, until that is not in place, we're bound by our mandate to deliver services. The mandate is normally renewed every 3 years in the General Assembly. In the end, of course, it's the General Assembly's decision on what UNRWA should focus on going forward. But clearly, we will be bound to continue delivering our mandate until the mandate is changed. And the change of the mandate is or would be a result of a broader political process. So in that regard, I think indirectly there is a link in the sense that the more effective Palestinian state institutions are that are being built, the easier it is going down the line to then, in the context of a political solution, to hand over our responsibilities. At the moment, what you see on the ground is rather the opposite, in the sense that the Palestinian Authority very much cash-strapped. There's a number of reasons for that. Millions revenues that are being paid, the socioeconomic downturn in the West Bank. So at the moment, the PA is if it was willing to and agreeable to Palestinians, not sure the Palestinian Authority in the moment is in position to pick up a lot of the services that UNRWA delivers in the West Bank. Having said that, we do have, of course, a very active cooperation with the Palestinian Authority in a number of fields. And we work closely with the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Local Government. There are ways where we actively cooperate, like solid waste management. So at the technical level, you have that engagement, right? Yeah. I guess the main question is sort of, how would sort of the Palestinian move towards more international recognition impact the pathways for institutional development on the ground? And that at the moment is really subject to political.
Yeah. I'm able to understand what you're saying, especially when it comes to West Bank, because I've been there. In 2016, we went through Jordan, and I've been to Jericho, East Jerusalem, Ramallah, Bethlehem, Nazareth, Nablus. I understand what you mean when you speak about the checkpoints, about the friction, about the delays, about the restriction of freedom of movement. Also, I went to a few of the refugees camps, like Kalandia refugee camp near Ramallah, and I saw the living conditions which were there, which was very difficult. Now, even specifically, there are two contexts that are greatly problematic. First is winter is coming now. So in terms of providing services, it's going to be even more difficult. When I went there, I thought it's the same, like it's showing the same degree of temperature here in Delhi, and there for winter, it's the same thing. So I didn't pack a lot of sweaters, but when I went there, I was shivering. It was like the Mediterranean winter. So it's huge. It's not, you need to have like complete cover up. It's huge. It's brutal. And the second is also with the conflagration of what is happening now in Lebanon, and if Iran will retaliate, then more and more refugees are going to be created over the period of time in this region. And the uncertainty will go on for a much longer time than even the timeline of getting the hostages back or a ceasefire negotiation. So in simple terms, the first thing is that how is UNRWA facing for the upcoming winter? And the second question is that how does the involvement of more regional state and non-state actors impact the functioning of UNRWA?
I think that's a very important question. I think on winterization, I would make a difference between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Clearly, the situation in Gaza is much more severe. People there are grateful for any respite they can find, even only for 2 days. And there is a winterization plan, which is not just UNRWA, working closely with OCHA, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, working closely with UNICEF, WHO, INGOs, ICRC, and so on and so forth. So there is a winterization plan. which will be challenging. I mean, the weather now is already quite cold for late September, Strip in the West Bank, and it's very concerning. Also because last winter, now we have much more destruction, more IDPs. Last winter, the bulk of IDPs, and in fact Palestinians who didn't leave their homes, which was a tiny minority, was concentrated in the Khan Yunis and then later on the Rafah area. About 300,000 Palestinians remained in the Gaza Strip, in the northern area, Gaza City, so on and so forth. Now you have much more destroyed infrastructure in Khan Yunis and Rafah, so it's actually more challenging. And at the rate of which aid is being allowed in, it's not going great. So there's a lot of emphasis now to put in place winterizations plan in the Gaza Strip, resource them properly. West Bank is a bit different. We've seen quite a lot of destruction in refugee camps in the northern West Bank since the beginning of the war. It's not comparable in scale and scope, of course, with the Gaza Strip. Let me be very clear. But it does have a direct impact on our beneficiaries in these areas. For those who are familiar with the geography of the West Bank, there are a number of areas in the north, the governorates of Jenin, Tubas, Al-Karem, to some extent Nablus, where you have seen Palestinian militancy going back years. So that's not new. But since the 7th of October, you've seen much more heavily militarized Israeli operations in these camps with the aim of at least ostensibly, weakening, neutralizing those armed actors there. I think what is really concerning is, of course, the way these operations are undertaken takes very little regard to the civilians living in the camp. You see a lot of use of heavy bulldozers, equipment, house searches, a lot of house destruction of private and also public infrastructure, road networks, water. And the Israeli military will say that is primarily as a response to the increased use of IEDs by Palestinian armed actors, which is the case. We've seen an increase and a spread in the use of IEDs. But the bottom line is that the West Bank, being under belligerent occupation, is still, legally speaking, a law enforcement context. It means the applicable legal framework is international human rights law in the West Bank. It's not IHL. That's the consolidated position of the UN, ICC, and others. So that means that the use of force we're seeing in these places is disproportionate. We also see concerning number of civilian bystanders being killed in these operations. And I think what is the most devastating thing is the cumulative effect on the communities living in those camps. Some of those camps have been sort of 2-3 days operations, closing off the camp, cutting electricity, water, in some cases 15 times, right? And it doesn't always come with massive infrastructure destruction, but the cumulative impact in some of those places is severe. And that means that, generally speaking, the refugee camps become increasingly difficult places to live. We operate 19 camps in the West Bank. We counted 5 or 6 of them are in the north and are currently in the focus of increasing violence. And the impact on children, school days, in some places we've seen up to 30% of the school days lost in the last scholastic year, is severe. Of course, the more violence is being applied, the more young people lose friends, brothers, other relatives, then the higher the incentive is for them as well to join armed actors, to take revenge as they see it. You have on top of that the constant media coverage from the Gaza Strip. You already had before the war, and I think that's something that's very important to underline, a profound loss of hope among young people in the West Bank, and particularly in the refugee camps. Profound loss of hope, not just sort of for a broader political solution, but also for improvement of their personal conditions, be it economically, be it in terms of freedom of movement. So anything that happened afterwards comes, of course, against the backdrop of that general strong sense of despair among Palestinians all across the OPT, by the way, but particularly, I would say, among young people, and in the West Bank, it's particularly in the refugee camps. So that provides then fertile ground, of course, for external influences, for manipulation, mobilization. Although I would say the main driver of violence that you see in those places at the moment is clearly the fact that it's local dynamics. I mean, as ever, all politics eventually is local. And while there are some reports in the media that sort of these local dynamics are being exploited through funding, through perhaps some kind of political support, I think a lot of what we see on the ground is really sort of conflict of situation of structural injustice, of local hardship, of people being impacted in their daily lives, and then basically coming together and it's not a new phenomenon. We've seen it sort of in the Second Intifada as well. From Israel's perspective, of course, after the attack of 7 October, there's a high level of sensitivity of anything that could look like a repetition. So Israel would say that really security forces are forced to conduct these activities in order to prevent a replay of the 7th of October in places adjacent to the Green Line, for instance, or attacks on settlements, so on and so forth. And we've seen an increase in Palestinian terror attacks against Israeli civilians. But I think the broader question is really how to create an environment where you bring a minimum of safety and security to Palestinians, which then allows political, at least allows some trust to be rebuilt, allows an improvement in economic situation, and allows also progress on any kind of political process going forward. Clearly, the UN are committed to the two-state solution. And I think there are good arguments to see this still as the only viable blueprint for a political solution to the conflict. But in order to reach that, you need to have a minimum of conditions on the ground. Yeah. I think the most concerning thing, I'll leave it at that then, is the increase in settler violence. That is something that is extremely concerning. You also sort of 15 days, you would have incidents of settler violence, and not all settlers are violent. Also, to be precise here, you talk here about demographics among the Israeli settlers in the West Bank. But you do see much more systematic attacks on Palestinian communities. We've recorded, I think, in 2024, more than 2,100 incidents of settler violence, with more than 460 Palestinians being injured. At least 10 Palestinians killed by settlers in these acts of violence, and it eats itself into the community, right? It's really something that is then very personal, very much impacting acts of Palestinians to land. You have the olive harvest coming up now. It's very emotional. And clearly the strength of the extreme right in Israel now, and the fact that some of those parties that actively promote settlement in the West Bank, or in fact even annexation of the West Bank, are now represented in the government, that of course is a completely different situation. That is also new. That happened 10 years ago, 15 years ago, right? And that is of a lot of concern. It clearly makes any process to stabilizing the situation in the West Bank and opening avenues for political pathways much more difficult.
Yes, that is one thing which I have been trying since October, in spite of knowing the asymmetry of the impact, but the silent annexation that is happening in West Bank, especially Hebron and all these areas, and the violence emerging there, along with the lack of digital representation for the Palestinians and so many advocacy groups. Like, I'm very thankful that you have internet and you're able to speak, but many are not able to post on social media. Many are not able to, they're shadow banned. They are not allowed to, they're blocked from various social media platforms. And this kind of structure is becoming very rampant right now. So, sir, my last question is that what would you like to say to the international community, to all the scholars who are watching this right now? What would you like to say to them?
I think, firstly, what we've seen since the 7th of October is really a watershed. The attacks of 7th October, they really unhinged deep-seated traumas on both sides. Traumas among the Jewish population in Israel, due to the Holocaust. It was the biggest number of Jews killed in one day since the Holocaust. A deep-seated trauma about Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip of a new Nakba, of a new mass displacement. And it's an extremely difficult situation emotionally. So the mindset on both sides, and again, I'm not equating the suffering of the people in Gaza and now with the West Bank or other constituencies. But clearly what we see at the moment is so much loss of trust between, at a time when some regards actually both Israelis and Palestinians, particularly when it comes to Jerusalem or the West Bank, are geographically merging more, because nowadays you have a lot a lot more interaction away, increase of populations on both sides in a very small place. Despite that, you have that severe sort of disruption of trust. I think a key step now is really to reconstitute a sense of safety and security, which is absolutely crucial for any political pathway to be possible in the future. And clearly, UN's position has been immediate ceasefire in Gaza, immediate release of all hostages, unfettered access to humanitarian aid, respecting IHL and ICJ related decisions in the West Bank, and so on and so forth. So our position in that regard is very clear. I think what UNRWA contributes in that very difficult context is two things. One is clearly, allowing for Palestinians to unfold their human potential through our services. Education, health, microfinance, and allowing for Palestinian, particularly Palestinian youth, to chart pathways for their personal lives. But by doing that large delivery of services, as I said, 96 schools, that equals roughly 50,000 students now in the West Bank, we of course also make a direct contribution to stability. That means, if you're not able to deliver those services, children will miss out on education. They will be out on the streets. They will be exposed to violence, and that would be very concerning. So I think the main message would be, one is that UNRWA's function in the West Bank really is linked to the absence of a political solution. Yeah. We are there. There is no political solution. Secondly, we do make a direct contribution to human development of Palestinians. And thirdly, we also, in that current context, extreme volatility, make a direct contribution to stability in the regional world.
Yeah. With this, thank you so much, specifically on many accords. First, that for such early in the morning, you gave us the interview. Second, in these very difficult circumstances, when you're losing your own colleagues, where there's so much of surveillance, where there's so much of, internet shutdowns and everything else, you took time for us. And thirdly, I'll do my level best that the history of UNRWA and what role the agency is playing is educated to the youth, so that we are able to create a dialogue and at least think of a better future. And thank you so much, sir, for the privilege of your time.